What is going on, guys? I am FlynnMasters, and today I am finally getting around to ranking the worst and best chefs in Hell's Kitchen history. Again, after talking about this show for over 4 years now, I think now is as good of a time as ever to officially give my opinion on the cream of the crop for all-time great chefs, and for today's video, all-time bad chefs in Hell's Kitchen. So before we begin, let's go through all the honorable mentions I left off the list, just in chronological order by season, starting with Dewberry, who, arguably the first donkey and was generally clueless in his 2 episodes. I just simply don't feel he did enough bad during a short time as other very early boots. Next up, we got someone who I strongly considered, and it's honestly probably number 11 here, with Polly. Again, an absolute donkey and aloof in the kitchen during the premiere. An iconic first boot for all the wrong reasons. So bad that, again, I truly did think she would be on this list for a while, but she just missed out. We also got Tom from that same season, who I actually think is the worst chef overall from season 2. But again, there's a difference between being the worst chef on a season and just like being the worst chef in general. And you guys will kind of see more examples as we go along. But again, when comparing Tom to some all-time other bad chefs, again, he's up there, but simply not a top-tier bad chef, in my opinion. Another person who I strongly considered was Jason Underwood, obviously an all-time hated chef, just not quite bad enough, in my opinion, to be an all-time bad chef, despite doing so much wrong in his 3 episodes. I guess he was also kind of overshadowed by the likes of Dominic and Sharon in those first 2 services. But he came really close to making as well, but just not quite top 10 worthy. We got Seth from season 5 as a notorious donkey, and the other donkey from that season I have very high on my top 10 list. But I don't know, I feel Seth, while obviously bad, was more so just an easy punching bag for Ramsay given his obsession with him, while the other donkey this season was just flat out top tier bad, as you guys will see. I mean, they made Seth look like freaking Megan in comparison. Well, maybe not quite, that, but still, you guys get the point. So maybe he is being protected a little bit. I don't think he's top 10 worthy bad. I know a lot of people would have this person in the top 10, and that is Krissa. And I talked about this in my first boot video, but while she was insanely clueless, probably the most clueless chef in Hell's Kitchen history, like, as a chef in the kitchen, we didn't really get to see what she could do. And I am not saying by any means she would have been amazing that season or any other season, but just a little too little to judge here for Krissa, in my opinion, to have her be like a top 10 worst chef in the show's history. Gia was a pretty notorious bad chef in season 16, but honestly never really considered her. Same thing with Elliot for season 19, a notorious first boot for how aloof he was and how much he seemed not to care. But again, just not bad enough to be a top 10 all-timer. And then we have Tad, probably easily the second worst chef of the 20s. And while an iconically bad first boot, again, just simply not bad enough to be in the top 10. So with those honorable mentions out of the way, let's get this list started officially now with number 10. And that is someone who I've called the most pathetic contestant in Hell's Kitchen history. And in my opinion, he's just flat out a top 10 all-time bad chef, with that being Jeremy from season 11. And again, it's not like he was insanely bad in the kitchen per se, especially compared to the other chefs on this list, and even some of the honorable mentions. But again, he was so laughably dumb and bad, just seeming completely out of it at times, being completely lost in the kitchen, even the dining room in those first 3 services. And the massive thing, and what puts him in my top 10, is him serving that sample plate. Literally the worst mistake in Hell's Kitchen history, in my opinion. So while I think Jeremy would absolutely be a top 20 or top 15 worst chef in the show's history without that mistake, him making the worst mistake in Hell's Kitchen history is what elevates him above some of the other honorable mentions I considered, and that's why he is here at number 10. At number 9, maybe one of my more surprising picks on the board, but I'm sorry, after years of talking about this show, I'm ready to officially call Melissa Doney top 10 worst chef in the show's history. Now, yes, I will admit if you throw out those last 2 services, she probably wouldn't come close, and it might be unfair to call her out for that when she made it either way farther than a lot of the other all-time bad chefs, or just simply wasn't as bad before then. But I don't know, even then, she was obviously no great chef by any means. I mean, she literally got kicked out of the kitchen in service 2, the only person in the right kitchen that night to get kicked out, and would have been the 3rd boot of the season had it not been for a certain other chef on this list. Had a bad service 4 and was simply outshined by Louis, just completely tanking on the blue kitchen. But of course, again, the big thing here is her final 2 services. Obviously, we all know the story by now. She wasted an insane amount of food in both kitchens, 2 services in a row on 2 different teams. And it's one thing to have an awful service, but to literally single-handedly screw over your kitchen like that twice, that's absolutely insane. So when you combine the sheer level of insanity from her final two services with her less than stellar run beforehand that honestly could have easily resulted in an early boot, I honestly don't think it's that crazy to call Melissa an all-time bad chef, and she is at number 9 for me. At number 8 is someone who I've always talked about as being a pretty forgotten all-time bad chef, with that being Chino. And like on paper, he has things going for him, at least when comparing him to other all-time bad chefs, and that he deserved to survive his 2 nominations and didn't even cook and serve his 3. But at the same time, he couldn't even be a freaking good waiter, so he can't freaking do anything right to help his team. But even those nominations he survived, like the fact that Ramsay called him down for elimination after service 1, when usually he doesn't do that for the first elimination ceremony, and the fact that Chino stood out to him so much that night, that he called him down to plead his case, despite there being so many chefs in the Blue Kitchen that night who also made mistakes, like that's pretty telling. And he only survived his second elimination due to Brandon being a freaking idiot, and then his 4th service on meats was just absolutely dreadful. So, I feel that Chino did absolutely nothing right in a span of 4 episodes. And while, yeah, maybe not as noteworthy as some other chefs we'll talk about, or even some of the chefs not even on my list, in my list, Chino is a top 10 worst chef in the show's history, landing here at number 8. On to number 7 now, one of the more notorious bad chefs of the teen seasons, with that being Kevin from season 15. And yeah, not only was Kevin awful in 5 services and challenges, but honestly should have been the first boot, or at the very least was just as bad as Mark. So you can't even use the argument that he was at least justified to make it as long as he did. As again, not only did he get super lucky to be spared over Mark, but the blue team obviously, won the 3 straight services, and Hassan absolutely carried the dude through those services, essentially doing all the work for him at times. And go figure that the first service after the Hassan swap, Kevin would do so bad that he would get ejected right then and there. I mean, he was so bad that the show didn't even bother to give him a send-off or final words, or anything like that, because frankly, he wasn't deserving of them. So yeah, just an absolutely dreadful run here. And I guess like those middle services, while yeah, he was carried by Hassan, it wasn't over the top bad, and that's what keeps him out of the top 5. But still, Kevin is obviously an all-time bad chef. At number 6 is someone who very could have well been higher had he lasted a bit longer, with that being the first boot of season 18 and Scott. And again, just an all-time bad episode here, or I guess in his case 2 episodes, but as not only was he completely lost in the kitchen, but his attitude is what really sticks out to me. It's almost like he was taking the whole thing as a joke, just smiling the whole time he was making mistakes, volunteering himself for elimination, seemingly not even taking the nomination ceremony seriously. All this coming from someone who on paper you would expect anything but this type of behavior, given he owns a restaurant and is like a freaking 40-year-old man. Again, his only saving grace is that he was eliminated first, as I'm sure he could have done a lot worse with more time, like some of the other chefs above him. And his signature dish wasn't completely terrible despite being really bad. But, again, these are very, very small positives, if you can even call them positives. And that's what keeps Scott out of the top 5. But speaking of first boot in the top 5, at number 5 is actually a chef who was last in my first boot ranking. But again, as an actual chef, I feel there are a couple of first boots who are all around worse as chefs. But nonetheless, still an all-time bad chef here in Hell's Kitchen, and that is Louis from season 6. And again, you could argue he deserves to be number 1 just based on stats alone. Again, that's why he was, at the bottom of my list for first boot rankings, because unlike all the other first boots in Hell's Kitchen history who at least made it to nomination ceremony, he obviously didn't. He got kicked out in the middle of the first service. But again, I do feel like with Robert coming back that Ramsay was going to eject whoever did the worst that night to make room, and in general make for a great moment. And that was obviously Louis. But with that said, yeah, Louis was just completely awful, had a terrible signature dish where he was even questioning Ramsay's palate, like, come on. Was cooking garnish on meat and then butchered a ton of lamb. Again, it's not like he got ejected for, petty reasons. It was pretty noteworthy and very deserving. So again, an awful performance. I just feel there's another first boot who did even worse than him, and other chefs who obviously lasted longer and had a chance to do a lot more bad. But nonetheless, Louis is a top 5 worst chef in the show's history, despite lasting only 30 minutes. Like, that should tell you all you need to know. And at number 4 is the worst chef, in my opinion, to be a first boot, with that being 22-year-old executive chef Devon. And again, I won't be the dead horse here, as Devon's premiere performance is a meme for a reason. And I just simply think he did the most wrong out of any first boot. As again, Louis, I feel, was more so ejected for Robert. Scott at least didn't have an all-time bad center dish. Tavon was just flat out awful to the point where he essentially single-handedly cost the blue team a dinner service on opening night. You know, very Melissa-esque. Like, we all know how rough the opening night service can be for everyone. And to do that much wrong and to stand out from the other 17 chefs that much is completely mind-blowing to me. So again, I know you guys might be confused still on how, you know, when it comes to me ranking first boots compared to chefs overall. But again, when you throw like the stats out the window, I feel Tavon is the worst chef out of them all. And again, could have easily been the worst chef in Hell's Kitchen history had he lasted a bit longer. But nonetheless, obviously an awful chef in the show's history, lands here at number 4. At number 3 is someone who I kind of touched on earlier and is the worst female chef in the show's history, in my opinion, with that being Colleen from season 5. And again, it's a complete miracle this woman was able to last 5 episodes, as it was just some all-time bad stuff here. I mean, in the premiere, she literally talked back to Ramsay and easily had the worst service of the night, and was only not the first boot due to the blue team being all-around worst. She had another absolutely dreadful service to follow and would have been the boot had it not been for G's quit. Episodes 3 and 4 weren't as bad, but still would have likely resulted in elimination had the blue team not sucked. And then she got eliminated on the dessert station in service 5 after not being nominated, and we haven't had a dessert elimination boot since. Again, Ramsay said himself, she had 5 services and all 5 were shocking and how bad she was. A complete donkey as well when it came to her actions in the kitchen. I will say I do respect her fight for sure, but honestly, that doesn't help her at all whatsoever in these rankings. It's just that the top 2 are so freaking bad. But nonetheless, Colleen is an all-time bad chef for sure, landing here at number 3. At number 2 is someone who I'm sure you all expected to be number 1, but at number 2 is the legendary Raj. And Raj, of course, is so insanely bad. We'll never ever see a donkey like him. Like, if you look through his actual services, I mean, it's not, like, awful. Which, to be fair, he didn't get much of a chance to cook. As episode 1, he was on the dining room. And episode 2, he, of course, was on garnish, where Vinny, you know, was intentionally not giving him anything to cook. But yeah, that's basically the only thing that keeps him out of the top spot. As again, the man is so delusional, it's almost comical. To the point where, you know, some people think he's a plant with the way he acted in the show. Like, that's how delusional he is. And when, of course, he did get the actual chance to cook in episode 3, it was an all-time bad episode, highlighted by some all-time dumb mistakes. Putting his head in the freezer, freaking eating the salmon, talking back to Ramsay, like, along with all those actual mistakes on his respective stations. You know, there's a reason why he's most people's top pick, but he lands here at number 2 for me. But to me, the worst chef in Hell's Kitchen history, drumroll please, is Matthew from Hell's Kitchen Young Guns. And here's the thing that makes Matthew stand out in the worst of ways, in my opinion. A lot of chefs either had one awful episode or a couple of episodes where it was all bad, but not everything was over the top bad per se, even if only like 10% of it was, you know, at least passable. Like, for example, look at Raj, like, you know, he didn't really get much of a chance to cook in episodes 1 and 2, so it's at least passable. Colleen, again, episodes 3 and 4, like, weren't all-time bad stuff. But to me, Matthew had 2 episodes, and it was literally 2 of the worst episodes in Hell's Kitchen history. Let's start off with the premiere. His little first impression to Chef Ramsay is serving him a plate of shit, and served an elimination dish so bad that Ramsay had all the blue team members look over it to see how bad it was, and it honestly should have resulted in a first boot, but I think, you know, Ramsay intentionally kept him around because he knew he'd be a train wreck in service, and that's exactly what he was. As not only did he make a ton of cooking mistakes in the kitchen, but mental mistakes as well, such as laughing during service, again, very Scott-esque, and using a thermometer in the kitchen. I mean, it's all so insanely bad to the point where Ramsay didn't even give him a chance to plead his case. I mean, essentially, that's, you know, like getting ejected like Louis. I mean, that's the thing. Matthew is a combination of all these awful chefs. He's a donkey like Raj and Colleen, just an awful cook in general, and aloof in the kitchen like Kevin or Scott. You know, so when you combine all these factors and the fact I just don't think he has any chance on any season whatsoever, I do believe that Matthew is the worst chef in Hell's Kitchen history, and I simply don't think it will ever change. So there you have it, guys, my official ranking of the top 10 worst chefs in Hell's Kitchen history. Let me know what you think of my list in the comments below, along with what the top 10 list would be for you. Be sure to hit that subscribe and like button, and be on the lookout for the top 10 best chefs next week. And with all that said, take care everyone, and I'll see you next time.